Last fall, in the first of these lectures, I noted that the two titles, Reading Hegel and Hesse Reading, were meant in part to remark a certain shift from the opening lectures on Buren and Serra, which would stay fairly close to being Hegelian readings of their work, to subsequent lectures in which the reverse flow would be more readily apparent. I hope, given the path we followed to this point, that it won't be terribly surprising that such a turn inevitably entails going back over some of the Hegelian passages from which we set out, but now with the object rather than the text in the lead. Of the 1,237 pages of Hegel's lectures on fine art, somewhat less than one is devoted to sculptural relief, about which Hegel says the following, and I'll throw in a couple of comments as I go. The last mode of presentation whereby sculpture takes an important step toward the principle of painting, this is a remark about logic then, but it also has an historical edge. Painting is broadly later than sculpture, is the relief. First the high relief and later the bas-relief. Here what conditions the work is the surface, so that the figures stand on one and the same plane, and the three-dimensional character from which the sculpture starts begins more and more to disappear. But the ancient relief does not yet come so near to painting as to proceed to perspective differences between the foreground and the background. On the contrary, it keeps rigidly to the surface, without making the different subjects appearing in their different spatial positions to be either in front or behind, as the skill of foreshortening could do, and, as Alice Riegel discusses later, does come to do in Hellenistic relief. Consequently, the favorite practice is to adhere the figures in profile, set beside one another on the same surface. But in that event, owing to this simplicity, very complicated actions cannot be adopted as the subject matter, and this has to do with Hegel's argument about the content that forces sculpture beyond itself. But only actions which proceed in real life along one and the same line, such as processions, sacrificial trains and the like, trains of Olympic victors, and so on. And this, I think it's worth noticing, places such relief as opposed to later, more perspectively informed relief, interestingly close to architecture. Still, Hegel continues, reliefs have the greatest variety. Not only do they fill and adorn temple walls and friezes, they surround utensils, sacrificial bowls, votive offerings, cups, tankards, urns, lamps, and so on. They decorate seats and tripods, and are allied with associated handicrafts. Here, above all, is the wit of invention, which launches out into the greatest variety of figures and their combination, and can no longer keep in view the proper aim of sculpture. It's clear that for Hegel, relief is both a distinctly minor form and very much a thing of the past. Relief, as he comments on it, belongs to the dissolution of classical sculpture, and so is twinned with the emergence of group sculpture, which also takes up the post-classical impossibility of sculpture. But it does so in an attempt to continue sculpture's principle, rather than move as relief does toward that of painting. Relief's historical fortunes will rise again after Hegel's time, when it will seem briefly to be of direct relevance to the description of sculpture. For most of the 20th century, it will essentially cease to be recognizable as a medium in which one might sustain a practice, although the word will continue to have an intermittently useful adjectival role. It's all the more surprising, then, that if one can set aside the particular objects Hegel clearly has in view and simply cling to the terms and sense of the general description, one might feel it to offer a pretty good frame for considering the work of Eva Hesse. Certainly one would want to give the lead here to his closing remark about the wit of invention, but the other comments about profile and procession or narrative, about the decorative and a certain proximity to handicraft, and a relation to surface that makes it essentially flat regardless of the complexity, curvature, and so on of the surface to which it is, as Hegel puts it, adhered, all of these might seem fit enough. It's a pretty loose fit. We don't really know whether our sense of the aptness of processual has primarily to do with the character of Hesse's ways of making art or with the felt weight of the finished work, a certain kind of temporality. And we're likely, on reflection, to discount the remark about handicraft as mere coincidence. Still, it's a thought that can cling to the work once you have it. If we look at Hesse's late 20th century context more broadly, we might feel that there is in fact a good bit of work to which one could in a general way imagine applying the word relief. Bontekoe, Johns, Manzoni, Judd, and Lewitt early on, to name more or less a random few. It would be striking then that in all these cases the term won't in fact find any consequential purpose, but will eventually slide off, as if trying to use it in these cases we find we don't know how to go on with it. In some cases we'll find ourselves more or less naturally preferring the word for what the relief elements appear to be challenging, presumably painting, which we will often take then finally to finally more nearly continue. Rosalind Krauss has clearly felt this way about Hesse. Whatever she does not in the end get away from painting. In other cases, Judd and Lewitt are good examples. We're just taking up a useful adjective, relief-like, to catch a moment in a trajectory that's headed elsewhere and whose actual terms can't be caught in this register. Some people who are strongly committed to calling Hesse's major work sculpture will see her moving through such a phase on her way there. And of course others will find the question simply irrelevant. By and large, at least until quite recently, descriptions of Hesse's work have kept it within the corral of the relief-like. From time to time one comes across a bit of writing that makes pretty exclusive use of the noun relief in relation to her work. And it's perhaps interesting that when this happens, it does seem to do its job easily and, so to speak, uncontroversially. As one turns over the general descriptive possibility here, certain aspects of her practice move at least momentarily to the fore, her tendency toward the monochrome, for example. More pertinently, perhaps, one will notice again how interested she is from early on in adhering things to her surface, and how hard it is to account for that interest. One may speak of collage in the early work, but what's going on here seems to have little to do with any of the interests collage has historically carried. We have cut-out shapes, rarely distinguished by color, never by material, and often only visible close up along a barely perceptible edge, almost pentimenti. There's clearly an open and more or less continuous passage between this and her later practices of layering, and one may also be tempted to link this material interest with a strong thematic interest in various forms of mechanical or organic jointing. So all that's perhaps something. Maybe it's even enough that I could, if I did enough pointing and quoting and so on, successfully bully you into calling Hesse's things relief. And if I were successful in that, perhaps I could even interest you in wondering why we mostly haven't called them that. That is, why we have instead mostly wanted to call them sculptures. I remind you that the catalogue Raisonné has emerged in 2 volumes, one entitled Painting, one entitled Sculptures. But what I want is something slightly different. I want this to be interesting because it shows us things about Hesse and also about Hegel that we can't see otherwise. Fully serious work on Hesse has waited a long time. It's been hard to find good words for her work, and the finding of them seems to have crystallized only with the last major retrospective in 2002. There are, as nearly as I can tell, a number of reasons why this has been the case. The previous retrospective, in 1992, had brought the standing view of Hesse to a point that I think a number of art historians and critics found simply untenable. The new show posed conservation issues that forced renewed and much closer attention to Hesse's actual working methods, and changes in the disposition of the Hesse estate opened up new access to her writings and drawings that rapidly unfolded into new views of the whole range of her activity. At the center of this, for me at least, is a very straightforward observation by Brian E. Fair, far and away Hesse's best commentator. Looking at this very familiar pair, a commonplace of the Hesse literature, she remarks that whilst in Judd a serial progression as here always presupposed a reverse order where addition is also subtraction, in addendum, addition only leads to more addition. The first thing to say about this observation is that, of course, it's just dead on. The second probably is that it is also once made dead obvious. So we should be a bit stunned by how easy it has been to look at the 1967 addendum and see minimalism and repetition, the rational and the irrational, the organic and the inorganic, the masculine and the feminine, but not actually see the thing, what it is. It's very tempting, and I think finally right and necessary, although that's going to take a bit more argument, to say that what has mostly gotten in the way here is the veil of iconography. We've had, I suggest, tremendous trouble allowing Hesse the privilege of not meaning, or at least not meaning in the first instance, that we have quite unproblematically extended to the other two artists of her immediate generation that actually worked up to her standard, Richard Serra and Robert Smithson, even though some such refusal of meaning must be part, at least, of what her repeated invocations of the absurd were aimed at. This is a reading problem of sorts. And seeing that may help bring out the interest of another of Fair's remarks, that, quote, there is something like a lack of punctuation between Hesse's works. They run on. Among the things on her mind in noting this is the unusual continuity in Hesse between so-called test pieces and things more nearly describable as scraps and the work proper, as well as the odd play around much of the work of both drawings for and drawings of. But it more broadly suggests that we might usefully conceive of the difference between Judd and Hesse as a matter partly of how they write, what kind of punctuation they use or decline. About Judd's kind of seriality, one might say, and I think Fair inclines this way, that it employs a very strong form of self-punctuation. No matter how many units a piece is extended, it will always and automatically close itself, justify its ending where it does. This is not true of addendum. There's no particular justification internal to it for its stopping where it does, and the terms of the series that inform its construction will never of themselves produce such a justification. The piece is not, in fact, grounded in a serial system the way that Judd is, and in the way a considerable body of related work, Louet and Bachner, both close to Hesse, come immediately to mind. Hesse has, and this is typical of her inflection of seriality, two systems going here, the variable system of intervals and the fixed repetition of the circular units. But these are divergent series and will not ever produce any points of intersection or closure. This piece, which I'll be coming back to shortly, looks even more strongly serial and is, if anything, still more radically irresolvable and arbitrary in its actual dimensions. I'm loath to call what we find in Judd punctuation at all. It's too automatic for that, as if one were to speak a language in which any sequence of words turned out, just by virtue of being a sequence, to be a sentence, be a language that precludes any possibility of mispunctuation or grammatical error. And that would be equally true of the range of Judd's work not supported by these kinds of systems. Mere sequence has no problem ending where it ends. By contrast, the mode of composition Judd means to reject is exactly the kind of thing that has often found considerable support in an appeal to the model of the sentence with its ordered possibilities of coordination and subordination and so on. Think of all the compositional equations from the Renaissance through Caro of bodily memberedness and grammatical articulation. Fair is surely right to say that there is in contrast something run-on in Hesse, both within the apparently serial pieces and in the relations among her works. What's right here would be both the appeal to something that is in fact grammatical and sentence-like in a way foreign to strict seriality, and the recognition that this appeal is entered primarily through its violation. Addendum makes Judd's seriality feel like a form of punctuation, while his appeals to arithmetic series in fact happen below the level of the sentence, and Hesse's practice appears as a complication or transgression of it. It's very much of a piece with Fair's point that she finds herself repeatedly needing to correct the printed versions of Hesse's writing, an odd word perhaps for what amounts to restoring omissions of punctuation or re-enjamming words helpfully separated by a well-meaning editor. Attention to this dimension of Hesse's work will more or less inevitably lead one to her fondness for Beckett. You can, of course, get there through the word absurd and whatever you take it to assert for Beckett or Hesse. But the path of the run-on leads more directly to the prose itself, to the flows of language and voice that makes Beckett's writing what it is. It's no doubt quirkier of me, and certainly less historically justifiable and altogether predictable, that I want to point also toward Hegel. Toward, more particularly, Hegel's insistence on a mix of grammatical punctuation and rhetorical counterpunctuation that he takes to nerve his sentences, his syllogisms, and that make text, that is, produce a writing in permanent need of reading, out of assertions that would otherwise be merely and inertly logical or calculative. When Hegel writes in a passage we've looked at before, that thinking loses the firm objective basis it had in the subject when in the predicate is thrown back on the subject, and when in the predicate it does not return into itself but into the subject of the content, he means to teach us something about what it is, logically or grammatically, to be a subject. In particular, he's saying that to be a subject is to be embedded in a sentence, thus essentially open to transformation, and having no graspable existence outside such transformation. When Fair notes that in a study for one of the accession boxes, there is a small sketch at the upper right that seems to be an attempt to figure out how the tubes were to be threaded through the holes in the piece, and then goes on to remark that this simple yet intricate configuration reflects in miniature on how her series work, as a lacing together in which each term is entirely incorporated into the next. The process is endless in the sense that the work of salvage continually recreates itself, as a means of redeeming the object as a fundamentally precarious yet structured thing without ever making it final or conclusive, to redeem without the rhetoric of redemption. I see her showing that Hesse has something to teach us about what is to be read in Hegel on these matters. The language of recycling and salvage that runs through Fair's writings on Hesse is notable both for the way it can seem to almost directly repeat Hegelian formulations, a lacing together in which each turn is entirely incorporated into the next sounds an awful lot like Hegel on how shapes of consciousness succeed one another, and for the way in which it pushes off any thought of conclusion or of a moment of redemption distinct from the process itself. I imagine she'd find my appeal to Hegel worrisome in this respect. I think that worry is both understandable and misplaced. As sentences unfold themselves into text, what punctuation marks out above all within the sentence itself, as for example in the commas in my titles Reading Hegel and Hesse Reading, is the insistence of reading internal to it. The explicit suspension of punctuation is a way of forcing the question of reading, even as it also offers the prospect of writing in its sheerest materiality, its mere ongoing contiguity and consequentiality. Think of Beckett again. So the claim so far is that Hesse's sliding quasi-seriality does this job in her work, tying its materiality to a structure of repetition that doesn't leave the work enclosed in itself, but drives it, work, sentence, proposition, beyond what one takes as its fact, say its meaning or its content, into a practice having the structure of a text, and I will even say, argument. Now, these last few paragraphs have drawn implicitly on the pages we looked at more closely last fall, which culminated with the emergence of the word plasticity, as it captured the necessity that propositions be read and not simply seen through, and so underline the extent to which for Hegel an object is never given in advance, but only to be secured, proved is Hegel's word, in its exposition. Hegelian outcomes are in a strong sense objects, except where they are the dissolution of their objects, in which case they show themselves finally as moments in the proof or unfolding of some further object. My claim has been that art is a way of thinking through such objectivity, and we are now perhaps in a particularly good position to see that should art cease to be able to think this, the loss would not simply be art's. Philosophy could no longer assume its own objectivity. It's then perhaps particularly interesting that relief is a distinct inflection Hegel can seem to read into his insistence on the plasticity of argument, as when he continues his remarks on the speculative proposition by writing that the placing into relief of the form of the proposition must not happen only in an immediate manner through the mere content of the proposition. On the contrary, the supposed movement must find its explicit expression. This return of the notion into itself must be set forth. This movement, which constitutes what formerly proof was supposed to accomplish, is the dialectical movement of the proposition itself. This alone is the speculative in act, and only the expression of this movement is speculative exposition. Or someone writes that. Not exactly Hegel, who wrote German and so actually wrote Das die Form des Satzes aufgehoben wird, and not A.V. Miller, who follows the standard English practice of rendering the word aufgehoben as sublated, que la forme de la proposition soit relevée is Jean-Luc Nancy's rendering of the sentence's opening. And it is, one might say, only in that translation that what Hegel writes touches on what in English and French one calls relief, and so on whatever else in Hegel, for example in the Aesthetics, might also be rendered by that term. But of course, once that's there, we hear in a way we did not before what Hegel speaks of later in the passage as the setting forth of sense. And hearing that, we see or see anew how the proposition means, momentarily standing out against itself and then receding into itself. Are we to call this translation arbitrary and the connections it makes forced and factitious? Or do we call it, as Hegel calls the fortuitous play of senses in the ordinary German word aufheben, in an extended remark that provides the central text for Nancy's, the speculative remark from which I've picked up the rendering of this passage, a delight to speculative thought? I'm not sure I want at this point to try to measure the distance between Hegel's well-punctuated spirals and Hesse's eccentric run-on seriality. But certainly I've been trying, in what may seem an unnecessarily roundabout way, to show addendum as a speculative reading, which is to say rewriting of Judd's proposition, returning its logical closure and transparency to its actual grammatical condition. This work, one of a cluster of closely related, say, run-on works, happens at a particularly interesting point in Hesse's itinerary, as part of the engagement with seriality that produces as its closing act, addendum. The title is one of Hesse's celebrated thesaurus words. I've often heard it pronounced comp art, as if it meant to be in series with, say, pop art or op art, or perhaps as if it were a brand name for Gesamtkunstwerk, or for a full-service art supply store, or a digital graphics outfit. It's clear from Hesse's own journal entry that this is not the word she's got. It's compart, a verb whose meaning she noted following Roget as to divide into parts, partition, subdivide. There's a mistake in here, of course. Partition conflates partition and portion, both of which, as verbs, do indeed catch a significant stretch of the word's historical spectrum, in which it names an action that can be accented either as division or as sharing. The OED gives this bare meaning useful flesh. 1. To divide and share with others. He could not compart with him his clothes. 2. To subdivide, partition, or mark off into smaller units. The crystal surface is comparted all in niches verged with rubies. 3. Architectural. To lay out in accordance with a plan, with a proper distribution and disposition of parts. Streets ought to be so comparted as to be straight, and so also I make haste to the casting and comparting of the whole work. As a noun, not the sense Hesse noted, it's a part along with others, a companion part, unseverable from one another, as being comparts of the same substance. Hesse will certainly have gotten its pronunciation right. The journals show her sounding out metronomic, and it's clear that among the conditions for her entry into her lists of possible titles was a certain sound or rhythm that pushed her overwhelmingly towards words derived from Latin and to which the blunt spondaic nomination of comp art is utterly foreign. Hesse's titles and titling practices are worth, and lately have drawn, some attention. Anne Wagner knows that these titles are, in Hesse, reserved for sculpture, which is right if sculpture is the right word here, and she sees them as in general filling out a sense lack that comes with sculpture. I'm more inclined, of course, to call the work relief. Certainly the first works that draw titles from her are better called that than sculpture, and so I'm inclined to see how they belong to the work slightly differently. The titles, even when she started stockpiling lists of possible titles, always come significantly after the fact of the work. What this fact is, when it becomes, as it were, visible to her, is no doubt somewhat variable, but the basic shape of the practice is clear enough in the wall pieces from 1964 and 65. Mama Boomba and Ear in a Pond are clearly different kinds of reactions to the sheer look of the thing, what stands out in it, but they appear similarly quick and unconsidered, things one can imagine Hesse saying, as it were, out loud and being willing to stick with. Mama Boomba is a kind of pure case, something she would then have had to figure out how best to spell, just as we kind of have to sound it out first and then remember how to spell. Ader from Decatur, Ring Around Rosie, another piece whose spelling I always have to sort of pause over, just haul up solid bits of language sparked by the pieces, while Ear in a Pond and Legs of a Walking Ball are either goofy or literal, witty takes on the look of the thing. Hang Up, which as a title certainly belongs to this group, is a bit of both of those. The later titles are different, Latinate, rhythmed, written, read, and pondered, not necessarily in relation to particular works, but prepared. The word and its meaning noted with an eye to the dimensions of a practice, as if promising, to a degree even miming, a certain measure or articulation of it, of how it stands out against itself, thus their attraction to pun and oxymoron. They're speculative titles, readings, I'd say, offering a kind of completion that does not so much make up a lack as it does continue the work at once toward and away from itself. Compart, then. It's a verb, the source of our word compartment, an interest in which is widely seen to inform Hesse's art, with some comings and goings, pretty much from the beginning to the end. It's notable that we've evidently lost any particular feeling for the underlying verb, or we are less inclined to see or name the work of comparting than we are to register its results, the individual items, the interiors it produces. When we compartmentalize things, we isolate them, lock them up. A Google image search gives you mostly images of interiors. Perhaps interestingly, the more adjustable the compartments, that is, the more the thing is made for you to set up the discriminations and relations that matter to you, dangly earrings here, hoops there, screws here, nuts there, the more likely you are to get a picture of something comparted. And indeed, my quick survey suggests that you're also more likely to get the abbreviated description 12 compart, as if the missing verb were somehow asking to be heard. We see one of these cases here in a photograph I'm hardly the first to have paused over on Hesse's work table, sitting on a grid that in Hesse's hands always shows itself to do the work of comparting. And here we have so-called test pieces, comparts one might now be prepared to say, comparted in one of the several cases Hesse shared out among her friends. Catherine Thume has drawn attention to this gridded page from 1967, on which Hesse is clearly trying out marks. Thume says, it seems right enough, that Hesse selected the marks she did, the cross, the small circle, because they were those that most filled the pre-established grid of the graph paper's squares. But the circle is the one that actively belongs to her fully realized drawings. And it does so not because it fills the square, but because it most nearly doubles it, giving her a kind of complex, comparted line with which she can draw. It's a version, I think, of the line Lepard claimed early on, a connector, a binder, and then sort of forgot when she turned toward what appeared to her as Hesse's iconography. It's related as well to Krauss's remark that Hesse's work concentrates on edge, although the suggestion that the edge that matters in Hesse is not within a work but between institutions or mediums strikes me as wrong. It seems to me more nearly right to say it works just along the seam that binds within to between. It's a part of what's run on in the work. I belabor all this because I think the urge towards mispronouncing compart and the replacement in our ordinary language of compart by the very different compartmentalize are of a piece, a real and historically specific bit of deafness to our own language, as if when the word vanished from our language, it left only a few bits of almost senseless wreckage in its wake. I think Hesse's reception has suffered greatly from this shipwreck. We don't, for the most part, see the compartings she makes, and so misdescribe the work. Wagner, tracking a different title and taking an admirably cavalier delight in the speculative delights of translation, loops the unique foreign word among Hesse's title back through Beckett, who had actually not yet written sans, let alone given it its English form as lessness, and then asks us to notice in the Hesse work the word entitles that, I'm quoting her, each compartment, though empty, doubles back and confirms the next. Each, though empty, is enlivened with light. Each, though a discrete unit, is riven with a doubling edge. Wagner's regular pauses, though empty, though a discrete unit, are concessions to the history of Hesse's reception. Riven with a doubling edge is the point of description that changes that reception. It's this doubling, riven edge that does the work of comparting and makes the work whole. What finally is comparted and compart? Seriality and syntax, the closure of the object and the openness of the work, the compositional terms of sculpture and the limitations of painting. Art, shown in its compartments, in its late modern comparting. Perhaps more particularly the comparting of painting in or as or at its limits where it does and does not, can and cannot own its thickness and the facts of its superposition. The blindness to addendum fed on the ease with which one could imagine it is simply made of external oppositions, horizontal and vertical, organic and fabricated, rational and irrational. Oppositions that effectively lose their explanatory power the moment one sees that the structure of the piece turns not on the opposition, but the fit between rationality and contingency, each in a sense supporting the other. It's this sort of thing that can be properly called absurd. Compart purifies this structure. There is in it no single moment or feature one can point to as opposing a rationality established elsewhere in the piece. Everything is at once rational and contingent, systematic and open to reading, neither clearly punctuated nor simply unpunctuated. So it's just here that it will also matter to say that what Hesse thinks through is precisely the comparting of the subject, and that she has no interest in the presentation of interiorities, nor any interest in the fixing of meaning. Fair and Krauss and Wagner have all, along somewhat different paths, made the crucial arguments here. The body in Hesse, it is surely there's no argument about that, is a body peculiarly unowned and defined by no simple boundary. It's a body whose flesh is that of what Nancy and others call a singularity, comparted, consequence rather than ground of articulation, and so not of an individual. Whether her vessels and boxes are empty or full, they are compartings before they are compartments. For such a body, gender is certainly a fact, but a fact of what Nancy in his writings on community calls existence absolutely in common, thus a fact cast against identity. Like Sarah and Smithson, she's actively engaged in resisting, reading and transforming the logic of minimalism, and it's a major burden of the present argument that in Hesse's case, it is in fact very much a matter of logic, of the status of that subject and the consequences of its ineluctable materiality. In saying this, I've mostly skipped over any extended review of the actual history of Hesse's visibility, the upshot of which would be, on the one hand, a recognition of a particular blindness imposed by standard modes of art historical interpretation, of a particular way in which minimalism played into that blindness, and, on the other hand, an attempt to insist on the importance of a non-hermeneutic space of reading, the space in which this paper, in effect, claims its objectivity. Hesse, Hegel, and Nancy unfolding into or punctuating one another as if caught up in the simultaneous reading and writing of a complex speculative text. The absolutely with which Nancy qualifies existence in common is Hegel's absolute turned through itself, and compart, vanished from our language though it may be, is the best English rendering of a verb central to Nancy's writing, partager, to divide, to share, to mete out as fate or lot, as in the title of Nancy's small book on interpretation, Le Partage des Voix, the comparting of voices, or, if you hear it a little differently, the comparting of ways. Nancy's argument in that book produces two figures that push the well-known circularity of interpretation beyond and outside itself. The first assimilates the image of that circle to the opening of the mouth, and then underlines how the mouth's opening of sense depends also on its closing, an intermittence apart from which nothing is said. The second, more philosophically elaborate image he discovers in Plato's Ion, and is that of performative interpretation, the activity of the Greek rhapsode who evidently merely repeats the poem, delivering meaning only by delivering the poem, and having nothing further to say about it, no responsibility for a separately statable meaning, leaving us with successive deliveries of the poem related to each other like a chain or web of rings magnetically held to one another. The poem, thus, at once singular and shared, repeated and divided in its repetition, its sense always outside itself, at its edge, with no ground deeper than the comparting of voice it essentially is. Interpretation here cedes place to something uneasily balanced between description and mere repetition, and argument comes infinitely close to mere citation. It's within such narrow straits that this lecture either will or will not have succeeded as a reading of Hesse, will or will not have caught or taken the measure of her thought. Arguments made in such terms find their more or less natural end by dissolving into repetition. Nancy summarizes the work of such reading by saying that truth is punctuation and sense is enchainment. This can also function to summarize and return us to the inner workings of Hegelian argument. Aufheben, Nancy writes, and we cannot fully choose between his meaning the sheer chance or arbitrariness of that ordinary German word and its translations, and the more particular philosophic meaning speculative thought would mine from it. Aufheben, he writes, is the form, the statement of speculation, because its contingency is a form of the idea. As if one finally learned what is at issue with the plastic exposition, that is, with the text of the Aufheben. The speculative Darstellung, presentation or proposition, is itself contingent, itself hazardous. The most constraining necessity requires that the absolute hand itself over to empirically determinate being, that it pass through and as this contingency. The chance of forms is thus its truth, and it has not been possible to achieve this without leaving some traces, incised or in relief, in the irregularity of a logical syntax or in the unsettling of a lexicon. As Nancy also puts it, the very operation of the Aufheben entails, in all its rigor and all its necessity, a remainder, the relief of its own forever improper, non-sublated wit. And this brings us all the way back round to the Hegelian remarks from which we started. Here in relief, above all, is the wit of invention, which launches out into the greatest variety of figures and their combination, and can no longer keep in view the proper aim of sculpture. This lecture has, I suppose, been an attempt at a particularly complex bit of weaving, or as one might better say, textile work. To the extent that it's entitled to draw a proper discursive conclusion, it must be that what Hesse gives us to think is the irreducible plasticity of sense. But just because of this, the last word, which is precisely not a word, can only be left to the work.